And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Monastery, the open bar of the internet, the world's greatest shit show, and the place where we, the good brothers and sisters of this most holy of temples, seek enlightenment through the drunkest, craziest, most batshit ways possible. I am your one and only gaming monk, better known as Milja, and with me I have a newcomer to the temple, creator of the game of lost memories, Nibiru, and as well as a man of many magnificent talents, Federico Sohns. How are you doing today?
Great. How are you?
Well, since I'm not freezing to death, I am doing good. um, is well, old man winter plays no favorites. I was dealing with a bit. I was dealing with a bit of an adjustment period this morning.
Yeah.
Um, but I do want to congratulate you on successfully launching and releasing Nibiru. And I'm
Thanks.
hoping I'm pronouncing the name right.
Yeah, that's fine.
Mm-hmm. Just a long time ago, I did a review on a game set in Tibet, and I kept getting pronunciation wrong, and I got roasted for it. So I try and make sure that I get it right as much as I can. Um, so in light of that, first off, before we get into the traditions, could you kind of go over the skinny about what Nibiru is?
It's a storytelling game of lost memories. It's a game set in this massive space station, which is home to millions of people, where basically players take on the role of vagabonds, people that woke up in the space station with no memories of their past lives, and they kind of go about trying to recover those memories and stay alive, or more than stay alive, just go along and try to see where this whole revelation of starting to remember takes them in a way. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Now,
basically. Yeah.
it is a bit of a tradition around here to start at the humble beginnings. So, in light of that, walk me through kind of your first experience with role playing and um what made you stick to it. Like, what was your first
Okay.
game? What was the first one you bought? Tell me some stories.
The first game I played was Warhammer Fantasy First Edition. I was 15, and I think we had kind of like a couple of sessions with just one friend. We were not doing anything by the manual at all. Like I was GMing and playing at the same time. Um, and I think one of my takeaways from that first experience is that we really tweaked whatever rules we found, so that maybe like he was role playing as my brother, and if I got hurt, he got some sort of bonus because of like the emotional connection we had and stuff like that. So it's like I think that like that first revelation after you play role playing games, or like if you're a designer, you're probably like, wow, this has like so much potential. Uh, Kind of like banking on that from the get go. From then on, I kind of like didn't really play that much until like pretty much about like 4 years later, where I started basically playing World of Darkness with a couple of friends. And from then on, yeah, just continued playing until I came to London, moved to London from Argentina, and started basically doing this project, Nibiru.
Now,
Mhm.
coming from Argentina does bring about an interesting thing because I'm always curious about the RPG scenes in different countries. So, could you go into what you can tell me about your experience with the RPG scene in Argentina?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, it's it's one of those fun things that like, and also being part of like the wargaming kind of like community in Argentina, it's very different. Think about the fact that like uh, to like a pretty big degree, the stuff about like having a really high inflation rate. Argentina has like the second highest inflation rate in the world. It's kind of like impossible to like live and buy games at the same time. So most of what we did was just like most of it was pirated, like all of the manuals that we had access to, downloaded from internet. The same with miniatures. A lot of it was like lead copies and stuff like that, or even like just playing with like little pieces of paper and stuff like that. Just not many people had access to, for example, original like Warhammer miniatures from Games Workshop and stuff like that. So yeah, it was one of those things that it was very small scale, very kind of like passionate small communities, kind of like driving this whole thing. Maybe in recent years, what's happened is that people would just like collect some money, buy like a PDF, and maybe print it out for everyone else, or doing something like that, but with printed products. So it's pretty much a very long-lasting community of like very passionate people, but it's still very small, and it's always kind of like struggle to keep up with like renting a place and maybe moving to different places from time to time because of like price. The biggest thing we kind of have as a, for example, like an event is one in the province of Rosario, which is kind of like a convention that I think, I'm not sure if it lasts 2 days or one day, but it's like there's a lot of people that travel like a pretty long distance, like uh, up from like 1,000 kilometers to get to Rosario, to basically have that convention for like a day. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the picture of it, and it's been going on for quite a long time.
Did you ever go to that convention?
Going to Rosario is like very very hard. Also, like it depends a lot on the kind of like experience that you look for, like in role playing games. Like for me, it was always more about like just getting together with my friends than going and playing at conventions or with people that I didn't know.
It's it's definitely an interest. That's definitely an interesting thing. And given what you said about getting and printing PDFs, that does kind of answer a different question that I have regarding what games were kind of favored. But I get the sense that that one would be a bit tricky to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's there ain't much of a difference, I think, in the sort of games that were played. Yeah, I think. Well, of course, like the big ones were always there, but the indie scene like kicked off quite a bit a little while ago, because a lot of those games are much cheaper to produce. So yeah, I think yeah, a little bit like here. It's just that the indie scene probably took a bit more time to kind of like ramp up and work out. Yeah.
Were there any when were there any homegrown games that you had seen in your time?
Yeah. There were several, though not nearly as much as you'd think. There wasn't much when it comes to role playing games. I think people were actually quite happy with what they had in their hands, and more worried about procuring the games that already exist and that we but coming up with like new things. There's a pretty interesting and quite rich board game industry that's kind of like slowly starting to walk by its own. But in terms of role playing games, there isn't that much coming from it.
All right. Now, let's shift from that to the early days of what would eventually become Nibiru. Now, in the main book, you did list off some of the inspirations, whether it be 2001, Alien, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and so on. But and I also see Blame in there, which as a fan of that manga series makes me happy, because I will make note of the fact that Blame is one of my favorite mangas to read, and I say that specifically because I think trying to turn Blame into an anime would not work, and when they tried, it didn't.
Yeah, I mean, they took a shot. It's a very visual and very particular kind of like story, I think, or piece. I wouldn't even call it maybe a story. I don't know.
I'd
Um,
I'd say a good contemporary to it is Cormac MacArthur's The Road.
yeah,
As
yeah,
in that particular one, in both cases you have a story that is 90% atmosphere and mood.
exactly.
And that
Hmm.
can work perfectly well in a book or in a comic
Hmm.
where you can take your time because the
Control the
pacing is
pace.
dictated by the reader. You don't have that luxury in a film. And something that you could spend a whole chapter describing in a book can be summed up in a second in a film.
Yeah, exactly.
But walk me through kind of the early days of when you were starting to piece together what Nibiru was going to be, because because I can see the inspirations that it certainly inspired, but what I'm interested in hearing is what was the spark.
The spark was the main mechanic, basically. The whole like memory mechanic. I kind of wanted something that I could work with that would mechanize words and basically kind of give some sort of like mechanic value, some sort of like gameplay element to the stuff that people would write. So I wanted to kind of like empower writing. And with the memory mechanic, that was kind of what kicked it off. From there, it was mostly trying to think about how the whole bulk of like the system would contort to suit that mechanic and to make it more interesting. So from the get-go, like the first thing was the memory mechanic, the fact that what you write has a sort of like value that empowers or that weakens your character. And then kind of thinking of, okay, if I have archetypes, how do those relate to memories? Okay, they're going to kind of give you a backdrop for you to remember and kind of draw inspiration, and they're going to basically change the rules a bit to adapt to that backdrop. And then everything kind of building upon that central theme. And last after that, and the lengthiest part of the process was the world building and trying to make it fit and communicate that theme essentially.
Were there any other games that you can think of that sorry served as mechanical inspiration in a way? Because there are a couple that I think may have, but that's my own that's my own bit of theory crafting based on what I've seen.
Hmm. Um, that's a yeah, that's a tricky one because like the only one that I'd say it's more or less that there's some more or less like direct kind of like comparison, at least, or influence, let's say, because you could
Mm-hmm.
probably compare with a lot of stuff, is Fate. I did take a bit from Fate, but outside of that, I think like one of the things with Nibiru is that I wasn't really influenced that much, or almost like at all, from other role playing games. There's one or two stylistic uses of a couple of resources that have been seen in World of Darkness, namely when describing archetypes, the whole stereotypes kind of usage, to kind of give an idea of how each archetype sees the others. But aside of that, not that much really.
Which in that case, I was dead wrong. Because and maybe it's because of the use of archetypes and the dice system, but Fate was not what I had in mind actually. What my guess at the time was powered by the apocalypse, apocalypse world, dungeon world, all that kind of stuff.
But
That was my guess because of how you used dice rolls for the game,
mm-hmm.
where
Yeah,
it's a very on off kind of approach.
yeah, totally. I mean, it's one of those things that, at least with Fate, it was kind of like one of those things that maybe enabled me to be like, oh yeah, the characters, that the players are actually going to write something down, and it's going to have like an effect, and then influence points, and this idea of making like a slight change to the environment, which is something that like every game is using now. But aside from that, yeah, not so much. Like most of my inspiration comes from other like sources, or other media, let's say. And the game itself is quite slim in terms of like mechanical density.
Hmm.
So yeah, that's I think that's kind of it with that.
Yeah, and there is definitely a lot of emphasis on making the station its own living thing, which is definitely something that that I appreciate with its approach. Because I will always lean more in the favor of of tailoring to a specific style.
Yeah.
That's just how I operate. Um, so was it a case where and maybe you already answered this, but what was it a case where where building the world happened first in development, or was it done hand in hand with building the mechanics?
There was a bit of world building, like in a very like grand kind of like scope, during the mechanics building part, but the mechanics part was actually the simplest one, let's say, or the one that took the least amount of time. The bulk of it came like afterwards, because at the end of the day, like that's the thing. Like I think I see a lot of games that do, and a lot of media actually, that does a lot of like heavy world building, kind of like work. But if even if you have like a lot of stuff that's very well written regarding your world, if it all doesn't like work to communicate the idea, uh, it's kind of failing at partly at its purpose, I think. I mean, it's you're building a world that has a particular purpose, unlike our world, depending on your philosophy.
Hmm.
So yeah, it was one of those things that I really wanted to have the mechanics down, and I wanted to know which themes I was working with through those mechanics. So identity and memory, in order to then be ready to be like, okay, this is why this city is going to be like this, and this is why this religion is going to be focused on that, and stuff like that.
Hmm. Sorry. And speaking of the whole memory thing. Now, the vibe I see out of this, and this is where I can, when it comes to memories, this is where I can kind of see the fate allegory, because in a roundabout way, it does feel like it's rooted in Fate's aspect system.
Mhm.
Not in a direct way, mind you, but in a way of what the former served as inspiration for the latter.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, and to to that end, when it came to nailing down what you wanted to do with memory creation, were there certain pillars that you knew about? Okay, this is what I want it to do. This is what I don't want it to do. And were there some things that kind of developed as playtesting happened?
There were not many things actually that developed during playtest. Playtest was more maybe fine tuning of some of like the adjacent to task resolution system mechanics. And maybe the finishing of some of like the more kind of like fancy mechanics like revelations, which are basically some sort of like system that goes on top of the memory system that kind of gives more nuance to the whole memory writing stuff. Um, it was yeah, it was mostly all most of it was kind of like dumped right before play testing, especially like the archetypes. They didn't change that much, I think, from the time before play testing.
Which speaking of the archetypes, I think we can go into a bit of skinny on each of them. So for the benefit of clarity, could you kind of go a bit into each of the archetypes and what makes them unique?
Yeah, sure. So basically, you have five archetypes. I think that some of those are kind of made in a more accessible way. Like, for example, Bright Town is a pretty simple archetype that basically is based around like a countryside village. So your past is in this village. So it's a very relatable kind of setting, which you can kind of like tweak and kind of imagine to your pleasure or whatever you want from it. And the idea for that is um, this idea that your past is in a way something that's very idyllic, that is kind of like the grass is greener kind of thing, or you don't know until you lost it kind of like idea, where there's this very big sense of nostalgia about your past that you're kind of like seeking if you're from Brighttown. It's kind of like every treasured memory of your childhood or something like that kind of like bottled up in this place, and you're desperately trying to get back there. That was kind of like the first habitat that I kind of wrote, because I wanted uh, to have like something that, especially like first time players that maybe might find it a bit hard to start to picture like this scenes of your past and kind of like write them down, that they would basically hold on to, and it would be easily relatable. I could be like, where did you grow up? Like Northampton. Okay, Northampton is a good place to start maybe, and pick Brighttown and make that your background. I think that's kind of like the idea with that one. Um, then you go into other habitats, such as, for example, the wild. So the wild kind of plays with this idea that in your past life you were a kind of like creature. So it's one of those habitats that what I wanted for the people that were going to play as like the wild to kind of make that a very particular writing exercise, where the way they would describe their memories and the stuff that they would describe, it would kind of push them to think about, well, maybe the animal that I'm representing has like a very powerful sense of smell, so I'm going to describe things in this or that way. Or maybe like it uses echolocation, so
how do I write that in? And kind of portraying like this scenes of like maybe what you would see in like some sort of like Discovery Channel documentary through the memories, and make it so that I also peppered in some strange rules regarding relating to other animals, and maybe like the bigger kind of like entity that inhabits the station. That's kind of the wild. Stop me if you want to like ask me something or tell me something. By the way.
No, good. No, you're fine. You're fine. Keep going.
Um, so with the wild kind of came a different habitat that is basically the machine. So in this case, what I was going to do is I was going to try and make it so that the memories for these vagabonds came from AIs. Basically, kind of saying that there's this virus that is affecting AIs and it's kind of giving them consciousness, and the sort of like memories that you start to recover are memories generated during this bout of consciousness. So you're kind of like, in a way, writing about awakened AIs as they go through this strange kind of like digital virus that spreads throughout the station. So in a way, what I wanted to do is with those two habitats, kind of give it like a dual approach to like one of the kind of like axis of themes, which are nature and artificiality. One of the big kind of like themes that I wanted to tackle, or at least to kind of delve into, was with the game, was this idea of what do we consider nature and what's artificial, and how would that change if our context or the place where we grew up in was completely different. There's a lot of stuff in the setting that kind of plays with that, and how like electricity and this whole like universe that surrounds you and that you're caged in is all made of metal and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So I think playing with those two habitats, with the more like animal side of it and the more like artificial intelligence side of that, was kind of playing a bit with those two habitats. And the two remaining habitats are, I wouldn't say maybe like a different take, a dualistic take, but there is some kind of like dual nature or comparison that you can draw from. You have basically the Dreadlands. Mm-hmm. So the Dreadlands are basically vagabonds from the Dreadlands kind of remember sort of recollection of like tales that are written in a certain way. It's I wouldn't say like horror tales, but a series of tragedies that serve to feed a parasite, or like you could also say that it's kind of like a symbiotic creature. It's kind of like ambivalent, depending on how you look at it. But it's basically kind of like a creature that lives inside you, and it feeds off the emotions that these tales elicit as you start to recover them. So it's a very strange concept. I think it's probably like one of the concepts that are a bit harder to grasp. But the idea with this one, and I think that what sparked it, is I wanted to create a sort of like tragedy as the game progressed. So the thing about this habitat in particular that is quite striking when players like first engage with it is that the memories that normally would give you advantages or disadvantages, they only give you disadvantages. It's like you get weaker as you start to basically get your memories back, and this thing that lives inside you starts to grow based on them. So I wanted to basically make it so that gameplay would track some sort of like downfall as you start to recover your memories and you start to become weakened by it all. But at the same time, the creature that lives with you and that in a twisted way cares for you grows stronger. I also like the idea that because this place that they're trying to remember the Dreadlands is supposedly such a place that elicits such bad kind of like memories.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that is kind of like completely opposed to Brighttown, that the fact that now they're liberating from that place and they kind of live sort of like in a more hopeful way in Nibiru. Like even if Nibiru, like the station, has its bad parts or whatever, it's still better than what you left behind. So I think there's a bit of like hope in the whole downfall kind of thing that they go through.
Mm-hmm.
And after that, the last one is the Dreamlands. The Dreamlands was basically, the idea is that, like with the machine, there is this virus that's spreading, but in this time it kind of like affects humans, and the virus kind of leaves those humans without recollections for a period of time. So the idea was that those recollections end up in these vagabonds. So you kind of like start to remember pieces of other people's past. So in a way, you basically start to find people as you go. And the mechanics of this habitat allow you to kind of like establish links. Maybe you find someone that you kind of lived their life for a bit, given that this virus was a thing. And you basically are able to write about many different life experience throughout the station, and sort of influence the narrative of the game in very subtle ways, because maybe it becomes like an answer to a certain problem that the group is trying to tackle, that there's someone that you want to convince, and maybe if you establish link with them and you talk about their past, you find the key to solving whatever problem you have. So I wanted to kind of like toy around with this idea of writing the memories of other people with it. So that's kind of it for the habitats, archetypes. Mm-hmm.
Now, something that I do find interesting, and like I said, the environment thing is where I initially had drawn the Powered by the Apocalypse comparison, because the vibe that I got out of it was very reminiscent of how that game does its playbooks, where you have this archetype that has sort of preset goals and a pool of advancements that they're going to pick from. Now, granted, Nibiru is a lot more freeform than that, and that's saying something, considering how rules light Powered by the Apocalypse is. But one approach that I can see happening, and I do have to ask if this was something that certain players had to be coached through during playtesting, is, in my experience, you've got a lot of people who will kind of build the bare bones of their character and not really put too much thought into backstory or the like, and just develop that as sessions go on. Was that something that you had to deal with during playtesting, where people kind of had that approach, or did that not happen often?
There were some. Then, of course, there was a thing where there is one or two rules that I integrated after a playtest, such as kind of like rewarding in a minor way, like not like game breaking, kind of like sort of rewarding, but rewarding like writing longer memories, or like more extended memories. Which, like, the difference, of course, is like writing one or two more lines than what these players would normally write. But I think in most cases, a lot of people kind of like had this thing where at the beginning they wrote less lines, like maybe they wrote like 2 lines, or even sometimes like just 1 line for a memory, until it kind of got going. Maybe like the second session kicked off, and because they had a stronger idea, and these are mostly players that didn't come into the game with like an idea of what they wanted to play, they would start writing more because they got more engaged with the character. I think the perception of the value of their character as they write this stuff in becomes like stronger, because you develop some sort of like empathic connection with the character as you go, and you invest time in writing and coming up with those memories. So it kind of pushes you, or it kind of entices you to write more. And as sessions just continued, most people started filling their memory slots, or a lot of times even going past the lines or the space that I had written in. So yeah, that's what we saw, at least in playtest.
Oh, all right, that makes sense. That definitely makes sense, because storytelling games are always a tricky thing to bring people in on, and I think that's mostly due to certain assumptions that are kind of inbuilt with the hobby. I'm not just talking about assumptions rooted in somebody playing D&D and little else, although that certainly doesn't help. But more of how a lot of games have handled the act of building characters for years.
Mm-hmm.
In that regard, when it comes to when it comes to memories, did you have a lot of people asking what were good memories to add and what were not good memories to add? Because something that always comes to mind with these sorts of mechanics is a digression I saw in 13th Age for their one unique thing mechanic, where they go into a spread about, okay, here's what constitutes a good example, here's what constitutes a iffy example, here's what constitutes a bad example. Did you have any instance where you had to explain what would be good and bad moves for creating memories with this system?
I actually can't remember a single time that happened. Yeah, I think it didn't. For the simple fact that I think at the beginning, I would just let people just write whatever they wanted, and they kind of went with the flow with the whole thing, and they would willingly then write more, especially when you have like the sort of like player that tries to drive the gameplay more, or tries to maybe excel at whatever they're trying to do, and you see them writing more or something like that. But generally, I think that no, we didn't have that problem. I think the fact that maybe what you're writing is pretty much left to whatever you want to do, kind of like helped in that regard. And in a way, the rules kind of start very freeform, and only once you start adding the extra bits and bobs with like revelations and maybe delving more into what you know or what you want to integrate about your character, then they start to get more specific. But at the beginning, I think that it helps that there's not a super set framework on what to write. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I do find it interesting is that I remember when I looked into the quick start version and then eventually into the full book. One mechanic that I saw in the full book that I didn't see in the quick start was gravity. Was that something that was developed late? Was that something that was introduced late in development, or was it something, or did I miss something in that regard?
Oh yes, it definitely was developed later. There is quite a bit of stuff actually in the quick start guide that is not updated in the core book as it stands now. Gravity was a thing that I started toying around with at the time when we launched the Quick Start Guide, which was kind of like 2 years ago or something like that, ridiculous. But it only came together after we finalized the sort of like world building aspects. That's a pretty much the example of something that and the mind mechanic of something that came basically and developed alongside the work that we did in those kind of like aspects of the setting.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Now, which I think it's definitely something that helps add a degree of oomph to the whole idea of traveling from different places within the station. And out of curiosity, if you were to ballpark how large the station is, would it be as large as, say, the city in Blame, or
Oh
smaller?
no. No, much smaller. Yeah, no, way smaller. I think there's actual numbers somewhere. I'm not sure if in the book or in the quick start guide, but I think there is something like an estimation of it being about like 1,900 kilometers in radius, more or less. So yeah, it's much smaller than the city and Blame.
Yeah, because, well, the city, if I recall, I think that was that was so big it couldn't be represented in kilometers anymore. It had to be
Yeah,
represented in astronomical units,
yeah, no, that city is insane.
because it encompasses, I believe it encompasses, I believe the diameter is the same diameter of Earth's orbit. I think
Yeah.
Earth and possibly Mars. I think it was like 13.6 astronomical units, which is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah, no. Yeah,
Uh,
no, it's crazy. I mean, Blame as like a influence is definitely about the atmosphere and the look of it. Basically, it's one of those things that I cite whenever I'm being like, okay, if you want to imagine how the space station looks like from the inside, imagine Blame. That's probably like the closest thing that I've seen when it comes to like direct comparison of how the whole thing looks.
which I can definitely see, because when I look at a lot of the environmental artwork, there's a, I'm not sure if this was something that you had instructed the art team on, but there's definitely a kind of vastness to it, as in there's a lot of space that seems to just go on endlessly, which can create the idea that that a single room is much bigger than it may actually be.
Mhm. Yeah,
Which,
totally. And it's one of those things that if you're kind of like familiar with the landscapes of Blame, and if you take like for example the maps in Nibiru, you could totally see how the landscape of the Blame kind of like planet thing, the city, could sort of like be reflected in that artwork in a way.
which I can definitely I can see that. And one concept that I did want to talk about is in regards to how you did the tracks, and more specifically the mind track. Um, Now, I'm aware that a lot of people are going to look at that as sanity, but is the intent for mind and the whole broken thing, is the intent that it's supposed to represent the conflicts between old memories and someone's current self, in a sense?
Yes, I mean, in a way, it does because a big part of it is completely linked to the disconnect between your old life and your new life. And one of the bigger kind of like things about that is that the shift tends to be in the nature of how you perceive things, and even in some cases what you perceive. In the cases of, for example, Brighttown being basically a completely different looking place, there's this massive disconnect that is bound to kind of like bring this sort of like destabilizing factor. I think partly there's a big part of the whole like doing the mind system and why I did the mind system. That was me being like, hey, there's going to be some stuff that I would like to address when it comes to like mental health. And I wanted to kind of use it to push a bit of a different take on what you would showcase as mental health mechanics, that are not like the classical Cthulhu downward spiral kind of thing. Because I think that's one of those things that maybe it's a model in terms of like mechanics, but it's not really like super up to date. I think Unknown Armies did a pretty good job on that, but I wanted to kind of like toy around and experiment with like new, more like up to date takes on the whole thing.
Well, in the case of, I know a lot of people have discussed the use of sanity when it comes to Call of Cthulhu, in part because it was the pioneer in that regard. But I think when it comes to it, that particular method of sanity works for that particular game because it's trying to tailor it for that downward spiral style that is in a lot of Lovecraft's work. But whenever you try and put that into other games, unless it's something that's Lovecraft inspired, like say the Eternal Darkness video game, which was a Lovecraftian game in all but name, it doesn't quite work. And it goes back to that whole thing of needing to have things tailor made. Now, the other thing to ask in that in that regard is when let's say somebody is diving into this for the first time, and they're having trouble coming up with what would make a good example of a memory and what would make a bad example. If you were GMing in that situation, what advice would you give them?
Good memory or a bad memory? Let's see. I mean, first of all, I probably wouldn't tell them that there is like a bad memory or a good memory. I mean, in a way, the whole idea of the thing is that as they get these prompts, first of all, they have the prompt from whatever it is that they're trying to do. So that's already a starting point to think about what they're trying to do, because memories come through action. So if you're hammering something down and trying to repair something, they already know from that prompt that the memory is going to be about repairing something. So that's always something that really helps people. Remember the prompt, remember what you're trying to do, and specifically, one thing that I did at the beginning of like people, especially with people that never played role-playing games ever before, and they had like their first experience with Nibiru, was being like, think about something, anything that you used to do, for example, in Brighttown, and let's try and have that action happen in the game. So maybe they actually thought about like what they were doing, and they were like, hey, I used to, I don't know, do parkour back in my hometown. So I will then put them in a situation that would have them roll for that, and they would write their memory. And that's when I think that with that sort of guidance and the fact that you have an inbuilt prompt for each memory, it kind of helps a lot. Because once they write that, they feel much more comfortable about writing, and it kind of starts flowing by its own.
which I can that's something I can see, and the reason why I focus on that is, again, I can see the prompting requiring a bit of an adjustment period for some players, especially some of my own students. So in in that reg- in that in that reg- in that regard, I did want to ask about about Revelations, and how narratively that could be, and that how narratively the Revelations could be introduced. Since
Terribly.
I could easily see Revelations being misconstrued as leveling.
Ah. In a way, Revelations, there's basically two sort of like design philosophies behind Revelations.
Mm-hmm.
One is just throw something out there that is just plain fun. And the other is a revelation that rewards you for writing in the way that you want to write. So the thing that's really cool about Revelations is that they will always kick off once people have some experience writing memories. So they kind of have gotten in the flow. They've written down 8 memories so far, so they can look at the way Revelations work, and they can be like, I totally see myself after having written these memories, writing memories in rhyme and getting a bonus. Or I can totally see how I'm doing this thing and I want to store memories in objects or something like that. So there's kind of like two different like design philosophies behind working in those Revelations.
Mm-hmm.
They are like, from the design point of view, like the whole process, they are very freeform. They're extremely freeform. I went completely out bounds with them when it comes to design them, because you have one that has you drawing instead of writing. I have one where basically you'll end up tearing the journal sheet apart when you use that. I wanted to like really like give this expansion to the memo system, so it will enrich the memories and the experience of writing memories. But at the same time, I'm going like completely off the wall with some of these, and you're free to use them. And that's basically what I did with them.
Mm-hmm. And in that in that regard, let's go into a bit on the station, because I think that deserves as much love in in this interview as it's given in the book. So
Yeah.
we have talked about the station, even though it's not as big as the city in Blame. It's nothing to sneeze at, but kind of talk about some of the highlight areas when it comes to the city. Sorry, not the city, the station. Ah.
The station. Uh, so yeah, basically you have what I did with the way the station is kind of like the order that you have is I divided it in 3 regions: Antumbra, Penumbra, and Umbra, and kind of wanted to showcase kind of like 3 different visions of life in the space station is differing on those regions, and kind of have them also prop up different types of stories. So Antumbra, which is the place that is closer to the core of the station, is the place that has the most access to life support systems, is a place where like the sort of like oldest records of like civilization are there. So you have your bigger city states operating in this area. So it's like a big sprawl, and a lot of gameplay is kind of geared towards a more social and sort of like societal kind of like big city urban play in there. The Penumbra, which is the one that comes afterwards, it has the whole theme of like higher artificial gravity kicking in. So because of that, people have a different like looks, and it's much more sparsely populated. And there's kind of like this big story that takes on themes of colonialism over there, and it's much more of like kind of like adventure and with more risks involved, because in Penumbra you don't get as much of like the it kind of feels like the station is not working to its fullest like capacity, so you get places that are more dangerous, and it's a bit more wild, so it favors more like action or adventure, kind of like mixed stuff. It's kind of like the middle point. And then you have Umbra, which is like mostly the more like unexplored, the farthest reaches of the station, where you have very little light, where humanity has kind of like barely adapted to the whole place, and it's much more about the kind of like the frontiers of what you know about the station and discovering these mysteries. Like it's much more prone to that sort of like thing, mystery stories that are much more kind of like esoteric or a bit like bordering in like horror themes maybe. It's kind of like a bit more out there, I think, in a way. So each region sort of like propitiates a different style of play, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when it comes to those places, and you kind of hinted at this, that some areas are going to be a bit more more action oriented than others, but what aside from other humanoids or humanoid adjacents, what would be what would be a few examples of some of the threats that somebody could see in the more dangerous parts of the station?
More dangerous parts of the station. So it's one of those things that I think danger is going to depend a lot on the sort of situation that the characters are put in, that there's always going to be a danger linked to the condition of the players. The players are vagabonds, and as such, there is a particular organization in the space station that is kind of trying to track down these people. So even in Antumbra, in like the big city, they're going to be in hiding. So there's going to be threats that are much more coming from like this ominous institution, whereas in the middle region in Penumbra, it's going to be a lot of like, because there's this big social conflict, which side they're on. And then in Umbra, it's going to be much more about the station itself being a dangerous place. So there is where you're going to get maybe more weird when it comes to like the fauna and the way the station kind of like starts to function in certain places. Maybe you enter a place that it has no oxygen, and you have to reach this place to reroute maybe the oxygen supply, or maybe you've been wandering in a place that has almost no light and you're barely hanging onto light, or whatever your supplies are. Because, for example, there's like this sort of like drug that people use to combat the effects of like high artificial gravity, and maybe you're running low on that. And in Umbra, which is like the worst place for that because it's the highest artificial gravity, it's going to start to kick in and affect you. So it's very dependent on each region, and they kind of fit different sort of like game styles.
When it came to the whole adaptation with artificial gravity, did you ever do any research on how lower gravity affects people when they're working on in space stations or the like?
I actually worked with an astrobiologist from NASA that works with the Science and Entertainment Exchange of America. It's an institution that basically provides free science consultancy for people in the entertainment industry. So, for example, the people that did The Martian, The Expanse, like they use this institution. So a lot of what we did was basically just chatting off and on about the whole sort of like condition in which astronauts live in, for example, the International Space Station, and how it would replicate in our setting. From a lot of those conversations and a lot of the information that we got, then we work with Joaquin de la Cruz, which is our kind of like kind of like consultant astrophysicist, and we started to work a bit on how the station like works in like a more kind of like wide thing, not just the biology, but power consumption and how power circulates, and how in particular areas of the station certain things like, for example, air supply works regarding artificial gravity. So yeah, there was a lot of research involved.
During the early development, speaking of research, were there any ideas that you can think of that you wanted to implement, but at the time, for one reason or another, it just wasn't working out the way you wanted it to?
Yes, yeah, certainly. There were lots. I think that maybe early development, I might not remember much, but one thing that gave us a lot of headaches was the torus. So the torus is this kind of like massive conduct that is sort of like a middle point in the station that serves to circulate air supply across the station. And one thing that we wanted with the torus is we wanted to kind of like make it an alternative travel route where you would have some sort of like barge or like a system that you could kind of like drive a sort of uh, between like almost like a ship, let's say, because we weren't going to have like ships per se in the setting, but we wanted something that sort of resembled that. So making that work, and at the same time thinking about how that worked as like an air supply machine and structure, that was that kind of like went through several stages where we wanted to be like, hey, we want to maybe make it so that the barges travel in both directions, and would be like, okay, no, we have to discard this because we're going to build this in this way. So there's only one direction which they can go. So a lot of there was a lot of iteration in that part, enough for me to forget about a lot of the earlier stuff that I might have discarded
I
regarding that.
realized that I realized that question might have been a bit tricky because this has been at least 2 years worth of development.
It's a great question, though.
But like it, like the way I see it, a final product is always the 8th, 9th, or 10th version of what was originally intended. Like development of any artistic measure is often the land of compromises.
Yes, indeed.
And because so it's always an interesting journey to see what ended up getting lost in the proverbial shuffle. Now, one of the other things that I noticed in this, and when I saw this in the back of the material, I was curious regarding the that whole iteration when it came to the creatures that you can find in the That Which Crept In chapter.
Yeah.
Or rather, if I want to be technical, of crackling skin and shimmering steel. Because what was there was were the more organic parts, was that something that was developed after? Because I could easily see with something like the station, the mechanical encounters having a focus. But was that something that happened, or did you always have the intent of having some biological threats within the station?
I always wanted to have that sort of like biology, let's say the autochthonous biology of the station. I mean, of course, a lot of it came like it was a pretty long development time. Like it's not one of those things that I just barfed out all of those creatures in like the lapse of 3 months. We always like develop it throughout the whole process. But it was from the get-go an idea that I think was going to be quite integral, because I wanted to use it to first of all push the whole idea of like a different imagining of what nature and what's artificial would be, because basically it actually all began with one particular creature, the sparkling, where what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a creature that its biology would work as a very simple circuit. So there was like an in and out, there was a little lamp there were a couple of switches, and the first concept of that creature was actually just an electronics sketch. So in a way, I thought that given the design process that was followed for that, it would be a pretty great vehicle to illustrate and push that theme. And at the same time, as I developed like the archetypes and stuff that were quite early too, I wanted to have a wealth of creatures that the people who played, for example, with the wild, could use as inspiration and to use with their memories. The same thing with the compendium of AIs working to basically inspire and to be used by the people that play with the habitat of the machine. So yeah, that's basically a take on it.
Now, in English. Would you believe English is my first language? The other question is, now there's already been a fair amount of stuff in regard to what's been available so far with Nibiru. But a couple of questions that I do have involves the future, and maybe some of this has been addressed, but has there been talk about putting in some degree of integration with with virtual tabletops like Roll20 and Fantasy Grounds?
Yes, I'm working on a Roll20 character sheet as we speak. Let's say yeah, that should be coming pretty soon. I haven't looked into virtual tabletop. I'll have to see. It's mostly just a matter of how much time I have overall and how much of it I can dedicate to it. I haven't had requests for virtual tabletop particularly. But I am working on a.
I use the term virtual tabletop as an all-encompassing for things like Roll20 and and Fantasy Grounds and Astral.
And Fantasy.
So there isn't a specific product named virtual tabletop.
Oh, I thought there was. Okay. Yeah, no. I'm developing a character sheet for Roll20. Yeah, we'll see how that goes.
Well, best case scenario, you managed to get it out there. Worst case scenario, a fan on the forums beats you to the punch.
Yeah, that might be.
As a The other question I have is what do you have in mind for for what the future holds for Nibiru as far as what you've got coming down the pipe?
I would like to mostly do probably a longer adventure kind of thing, pre-built. I think anything that players can just take and run is always going to be like welcome. And particularly, there's a lot of stuff that I'd like to explore about the setting that I can do with like just new adventures and coming out with maybe something like that works as a longer series of chain kind of like sessions.
Like a season?
Um, yeah, kind of like a season product. That is likely to be the case. It depends a lot on basically how well the game is received. It's doing quite well, and mostly about time. Because at the same time, of course, I have other ideas for new worlds, which I kind of have to always weigh in when it comes to how much time new stuff basically will take
Um,
for Nibiru. For
has
now, it's
the
mostly just supporting it. And yeah. Mhm.
has the thought of new environments ever crossed minds, or is that
Yes.
something that's not been um put much I don't want to say put much thought into because that sounds dismissive, but it hasn't been prioritized as much.
Yes, yes, indeed. I mean, with environments, you mean like expanding on the areas of the station or new habitats, basically new archetypes?
Habitants.
Yes, I do have one that's there, and that I didn't integrate it because I think it kind of like I came up with it at the end of the development phase, so it was kind of late for it. But it could definitely be just slotted on like a sort of like companion supplement or a bigger sort of like series thing.
Hmm.
But it's there, and I think it's an interesting one. Mhm.
Now, if you were to give a kind of final defining statement regarding what Nibiru is to somebody who asked what is Nibiru, what would that statement be?
I would say that it's a game about memory, identity, and it basically gives you all the tools to empower you to write and express yourself. If you want to basically just if you have an idea for a character, and if you're one of those people, particularly that like wrote extensive pages upon pages of like character background, and you want to actually feel empowered and write those down and see how it develops, and particularly to develop a very close connection with your character as you go. This is kind of like the game for you. It places a lot of value on what you create and what you develop personally for your character, and that's kind of like what you get with this game.
Hmm. Now, I do want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your schedule and out of the whole moving process
Yeah,
to
no.
to sit down at the quote unquote open bar of the internet. Um,
Yeah,
and and whenever what's coming around next on the pipe, the bar is always open to you, man.
awesome. Thanks
Yep.
for having me.
Yep. And in the meantime, there will definitely be some more fun stuff coming, especially since due to being in the States, ladies and gentlemen, it's a 3-day weekend for me. But until next we meet, on behalf of the good brothers present and not present, my name is Mildra. I am your gaming monk. Stay fucking frosty, everybody.